Hey guys, how's it going? The idea that Jesus is co-equal with the Father is just simply not taught in Scripture. And there's no way to get around the fact that the clear, simple, straightforward passages indicate that Jesus was subordinate to the Father, he currently is subordinate to the Father, and in all eternity in the future, after the second coming, Jesus is going to be subordinate to the Father. And so we can clearly see this in John chapter 14, verse 28, where Jesus teaches his disciples that the Father is greater than I. Now, I know this simple, plain passage is difficult for some people to understand because it seems that Jesus is flat out denying the suggestion that he is co-equal with the Father, which, of course, he is. He is saying that the Father is greater than I, which is fairly obvious. All of God's creation, including Jesus, is subordinate to and lesser than the Father, who is the creator of all things. But this teaching of Jesus is something that the Apostle Paul also picked up. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul says in 3 different passages that Jesus is subordinate to the Father. So at the very end of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, in chapter 3, verse 23, he says that humanity belongs to Christ and Christ belongs to God. Notice that God, for Paul, is not the triune God. God is the Father, and Jesus is someone who is distinct from God. But Christ belongs to God, and of course, humanity belongs to Christ. And then Paul says this again, the second time, in chapter 11, verse 3, where Paul says, I want you to know and understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husbands are the head of wives, and God is the head of Christ. So let's make sure that we got that hierarchy clear. Paul says that God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of man, and the husbands are the head of the wives. And so that much is very clear. Again, notice that Paul is quite clear that God is not the triune God. God is someone who is distinct from Christ. God, of course, is the Father alone, and Jesus is subordinate to God. And this, of course, is something that Paul wants us to know and understand. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. God is the head of Christ. They're distinct, and Jesus is subordinate to God. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says in verse 28 that when all things are subject to God, that of course is going to include the Son, because the Son is included in the reference of all things so that God can be all in all. And this, of course, is going to happen at the second coming, to where all things are going to be subjected to God, and that, of course, includes Christ. So, in summary, Jesus was subordinate to God during his ministry. He is subordinate to God right now, and he's going to be subordinate to God throughout all eternity. Don't forget to subscribe.